G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined the pub test, and we are continuing to look at the crime scenes of the 5 official victims of Jack the Ripper. And in this one, we are discussing Annie Chapman, who was found at 29 Hanbury Street. Now, there was some considerable debate about the exact events of what happened on the morning of September the 8th, 1888. Now, the first person we are going to talk about is John Richardson, the person who lived in that building. Now, there were 3 generations of Richardsons living at 29 Hanbury Street. Now, there were 3 generations of Richardsons living in this building at 29 Hanbury Street. John Richardson's mother had a grandson, Thomas, living at her section of the building. So whether that was John's son, I really don't know. I could not find that connection. So if someone can help me out with that, let me know. But there were other families and other people living in this building. Also, there was a couple of businesses being operated out of it, but they were owned by the Richardsons. So they, at the time, would have been quite well off. But it said that John Richardson went downstairs at about 4:45 and sat on the steps of the back area of this 29 Hanbury Street. Now, he had a 5-inch knife with him, and he's just cutting something off his shoe. Now, it's said that when he worked in the basement of that building, he wore a leather apron as part of the job that he was doing. And for some reason, that very leather apron was in the backyard. But he says he saw nothing untoward, and he went off to the market. But it was about half hour later, or a bit more, around 5:20 a.m., the neighbour next door, Albert Kadosh, that's what I'm running with. It was type of a French name, so I don't do French very well. I don't do English very well, so just help me out here. Run with it. I'm calling him Kadosh. He hears a noise across the fence, someone saying no, and then a thump against the fence next door. But he says he did not see that back door open or close at any stage. Now, there was a high fence separating the 2 dwellings in the backyard area. Now, the backyard area often carried your toiletry needs out the back because there wasn't a lot of running plumbing in London at the time. So that's possibly where he was headed out to just relieve himself for the morning. But the door would easily be seen from his side of the fence, because the steps going up to the back door, you would have been able to see half the door because of the steps going up. And he says that never happened, and he didn't really hear anything else after that. But why would you not pop your head over the fence if you heard that going on to check what was happening? Well, as he points out, it was quite a common occurrence for that to happen, because 29 Hanbury Street had a bit of a reputation, you could say, not from the residents, but the front door was never locked. Neither was the back door. If you knew how to unlatch, you could use the corridor to go to the backyard. And if you did that, it was a little bit secluded. And then you could get up to secluded activities together if you needed. And that was mentioned at the inquest, that many people who were looking for a spot to carry on that activity knew that they could use that area. So it wasn't that uncommon to hear noises in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. But now Kadosh, he leaves for work and heads east down Hanbury Street. Coming from the opposite direction is Elizabeth Long. Now, she first states that she got into the street at 5:30 a.m. That would have meant by the time Albert left, she would have seen him walking away. But she says she saw a man and a woman, and they are having a conversation, and she says the woman said yes. She doesn't look back. She keeps walking down Hanbury Street. She later says that it was Annie Chapman standing on the street at 5:30 a.m. with this bloke. She did not pay that much attention because that happened a lot. But at this point, who's telling the truth And who's being a little bit misinformed? Because Albert and Elizabeth would have had to have seen each other on that street if they are stating the correct time. Elizabeth said at the inquest that the brewer's clock struck 5:30 a.m. and then she started into Hanbury Street. So she could have been a few minutes later. And that is important to note. So that does corroborate Albert's story and Elizabeth's story at this point. But now John Davis, who lived in 29 Hanbury Street with his family, he came downstairs to go out to the backyard, probably for the same reason everybody did early of the morning, and finds Annie Chapman there. He goes off. He goes to get the police, but he sees two blokes and says, "Hey, there is a dead woman. You've got to go keep an eye out there." And he runs off to the police station. The police turn up. They get the doctor, and the doctor says she was probably murdered at 4:30 a.m. because of the rigor mortis that had set in, which totally contradicts everyone else's statement at this point. Because John Richardson was sitting at the back steps exactly where the body would have been. Even though it wasn't fully lit at the time, it still would have been a bit dark. Even he says if she had been there, I couldn't have missed it. I mean, I basically would have had my feet on top of her. Elizabeth Long says she saw Annie Chapman in the street after 5:30 a.m. And with Albert's statements, it seems all very, very odd. Well, the doctor at the inquest does actually say, well, look, I could have got it wrong. It was a cold morning, so perhaps the rigor mortis set in quicker, and because of blood loss and everything, that can happen. I don't know enough about it, but I'd say that medical science back then wasn't as it is today as well. But what actually happened? Because at the coroner's inquest, all these statements were pretty much verified. Now, of the four we've mentioned so far, the only real question at the coroner's inquest came to John Davis, who found the body, in that who were the two blokes that he asked to stay with the body, because apparently they weren't there when the police arrived. And he said, look, I don't know their names, I know where they work, I could point them out. And the coroner's saying, look, we got to find these blokes. Now, I would assume that the police investigated that and did actually find the two people and then could just eliminate that. But I could not find any records to say that they followed that up. But it does seem odd that he tells two people to stay there and they're not around. But of course, as with Lechmere and Paul, well, maybe they had to be at work. So they said, well, forget this. I don't have to hang around. I'm off ski. But looking at John Richardson, there's some questions here. Now, remembering the doctor initially said the death occurred at 4:30, he said he was on his back step at 4:45 with a knife, but no body was there. The police find the infamous leather apron underneath a tap, and it had been washed. Now, Richardson's mother, who owned the building, said that she found this apron. It needed a wash. She took it out the back a few days earlier, and it was just left under the tap. Now, that would seem really, really odd to me, except the fact that she was the landlady of the entire building. So any tenant would see that, know it belonged to John, and go, well, look, just leave it. Not our problem. Don't want to create a fuss. But it was said that the leather apron was wet. Now, who would be washing a leather apron on a cold morning? Or who would even be using the tap outside there on a really cold morning? Maybe to wash your hands, but still, why would you leave that apron underneath the tap where people just wash their hands after they've gone out to the outhouse out the back? I don't know, just seems a bit strange. Now, it has been said and theorised that maybe John Richardson himself needs to be looked into a bit more. He often went to the markets. He knew the streets. There was 3 generations of Richardsons living in that house, as we've mentioned. There doesn't seem to be any mention of a wife, girlfriend, or anything like that for him. Now, it's said that perhaps Amelia Richardson, John's mum, came down the steps a bit earlier than what she stated, saw the body in the backyard, said no, fainted against the fence, and they're the noises that Albert heard, not the interaction of two people conducting early morning business. Then when she gets her senses, she starts washing that leather apron and then goes upstairs, sends the grandson down to say, hey, what's the commotion? About an hour later or so, and he comes up and says, hey, a woman's been murdered. And she was covering for her son, knowing that he was probably the person that did it, for whatever reason. Now, I know people would say straight away, but that seems a bit weird. Why would you go mutilate someone like that in your own backyard and then casually walk off to a market? Well, that's exactly the argument that people use for Charles Lechmere. That he's just casually walking off to work, bumping a few people off on the way and continuing on his way. So, it's possible people could be doing that. So it does raise questions. Now, we know that leather apron caused a massive stir in the papers because this is where the Jack the Ripper saga just took off. And John Pfizer, yes, he gets dragged into that coroner's inquest because he was known as Leather Apron. And obviously he gets exonerated from at least committing these crimes, though he wasn't a great individual. Now, Elizabeth Long's testimony actually does support the Charles Lechmere theory. Because if she says she saw two people in Hanbury Street around 5:30 a.m., this person takes Annie to that backyard, does what he does, and then merrily continues on with his day without any concern in the world. The path was on the way to Lechmere's work. He would have gone near there. Elizabeth Long's testimony, though, has been questioned. Like, firstly, she made the mistake about when she was in the street. She did correct that. Other people suggest she could not have recognized Annie Chapman, particularly just in a passing go, because she wasn't paying that much attention, because those sorts of events were always happening. And because she didn't see the body until days later. So people do question whether or not she saw Annie Chapman, or was it two other people. But that moves us to the fourth person here, Albert Kadosh. Or is it Albert? I don't know, but he was French. The thing is here, a lot of what actually happened to Annie Chapman rests on the testimony of Elizabeth Long and Albert Kadosh. And people put more credit on Albert Kadosh. Why? Because he was a carpenter. He was a family man. He had about 6 kids living next door. So that sort of hard-working person, people would take more credit on their testimony than you would some woman. Because that was the attitude. I'm not saying that's right, but that was the attitude back then. Yet, and here is something very, very interesting. It was only a couple of years later that this bloke leaves his wife and kids, says he's about 10 years younger than he actually is on the marriage certificate, and married someone else while still legally married to his wife. And that is a bit of an attitude that we saw in quite a few suspects, ones who who had no compunction about other people's feelings. And that shows this bloke really looked after himself. Deep down, he must have been a narcissistic individual, which is a bit of a quality we would see in certain serial killers. Now, in this new relationship, he has a child. He dies of a heart attack not long after the child's born, and sadly, the child itself also died about 3 months after his death. And that was the story of Albert Kadosh. And that information only came to light recently, in the last 15 years or so, because no one knew what happened to this bloke after this inquest. But that just then cast massive doubt on what he said and heard. Because if what he said was correct, that he never saw that door open, then what happened when these two people were in that backyard? If Annie Chapman had have said no, they would have been out that door straight away, even with a little bit of push and shove that apparently may have gone on with the noise against the fence. But he says he never saw anything, and everyone accepted that. But if we take away his testimony, because now we got to question whether or not he was being truthful, Well, it does change the entire scope of people who could have committed this crime. If Elizabeth Long is correct, we can rule out John Richardson. Certainly can't rule out some of the primary suspects who were in the area at the time, which we will look at some of them next. Now, we haven't looked at the police in this one yet, but we will. To me, this is a great whodunit story just on its own with these four. You got someone who saw nothing, you got someone who saw someone, you got someone who heard something, and then you got the person that actually found the body. Now, if you could find out which one was not being truthful, it changes the stories of all the others massively. So let me know in comments what you think. Who do you think was reliable? Were they all reliable? Did they really paint the picture of what happened that morning, or was there some embellishments, some omissions, or maybe some deception going on as well? There's a lot more to unpack with this particular crime scene. So keep an eye out for the next few videos. And thank you so much for watching. It genuinely is appreciated. I'm Owen. You've been watching The Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.